Close your eyes and listen. When you hear the word clap, you likely think of applause, a sound of celebration, of victory. But for centuries of human history, that sound signaled something far more sinister. In the dark, grimy back rooms of medieval barber surgeons, the clap was not a metaphor for a sexually transmitted infection. It was a literal, physical instruction. A sudden, violent smashing of the hands against the infected male organ. A desperate, brutal attempt to force out the blockage of pus that had sealed the body shut. Tonight, we must shatter the modern illusion that gonorrhea is merely a minor inconvenience. A nuisance easily banished with a trip to the clinic and a single pill. For most of our history, this microscopic predator was a true biological monster. It turned the most basic human function, urination, into an ordeal comparable to passing molten lead or shards of broken glass. Before the miracle of antibiotics, the cure was often infinitely more terrifying than the disease itself. We are traveling back to an era where medicine meant injecting toxic liquid mercury directly into the urethra, scraping delicate internal canals with metal hooks, or burning the eyes of newborns with silver to save them from permanent darkness. This is the story of Neisseria gonorrhoeae, a silent, resilient passenger that has traveled with humanity since the dawn of civilization. It has decimated armies more effectively than bullets, blinded thousands of innocent children, and driven grown men to submit to unimaginable torture in the hopes of relief. From the dusty papyrus scrolls of ancient Egypt to the humiliating prophylaxis stations of the world wars, we are about to open the archives of agony. Welcome to the 9 p.m. Historian. Tonight, we investigate the horrifying truth behind the clap. Chapter 1. The Flow of Seed, Ancient Origins. If the Great Pox, or syphilis, was the explosive cinematic horror that crashed onto the European stage in 1495, then gonorrhea is the quiet, insidious stalker that has been hiding in the shadows since the very dawn of human civilization. It did not arrive on a ship from the New World. It evolved alongside us. As long as humans have sought the warmth of another body, this bacteria has been there, waiting to exact a painful toll. To find the origins of this scourge, we must look back much further than the Renaissance. We must unroll the fragile, crumbling scrolls of the Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical text dating back to 1550 BC. Here, amidst remedies for crocodile bites and headaches, ancient scribes described a condition known as strangury, a torturous difficulty in passing urine accompanied by a burning sensation. The Egyptians, with their rudimentary understanding of the body, attempted to treat this heat with soothing mixtures of cow's milk, honey, and bread dough. One can only imagine the futility of such gentle remedies against a bacterial infection that was actively stripping the lining of the urethra. But it is in the Bible, specifically the book of Leviticus, that we see the first true attempt to contain the disease through the law of the unclean. The ancient Hebrews did not have microscopes, but they understood the concept of contagion. Leviticus chapter 15 describes a man with a running issue out of his flesh. The text paints a picture of a society terrified of this mysterious fluid. Every bed the infected man slept on, every saddle he rode upon, and every person he touched was considered ritually unclean. Earthenware vessels he touched had to be shattered. Wooden vessels had to be rinsed with water. It was a primitive form of quarantine, born not of medical science, but of a desperate fear of spiritual and physical pollution. However, the name we use today, gonorrhea, comes from the 2nd century AD, coined by the famous Greek physician Galen. And this name reveals a fundamental, tragic misunderstanding that would plague medicine for nearly 2,000 years. Galen observed the thick white discharge characteristic of the infection and mistook it for semen. He combined the Greek words gonos, seed, and rhoia, flow, to create gonorrhea, literally meaning the flow of seed. This was a catastrophic error. Galen believed the disease was an involuntary leakage of a man's vital essence, a weakness of the body that couldn't hold its seed, rather than an infectious invasion of pus and inflammation. Because of this, early treatments focused on tightening the body or stopping the flow through astringents, completely ignoring the infection festering inside. Men weren't just suffering from pain. They believed they were slowly leaking away their masculinity, drop by agonizing drop. The history of gonorrhea became even darker and more confused during the Renaissance. When syphilis exploded across Europe in the late 15th century, panic blinded the medical community. For centuries, doctors believed syphilis and gonorrhea were simply different stages of the same disease. This Unitarian theory led to horrific malpractice. Patients with simple gonorrhea were subjected to the brutal mercury treatments reserved for syphilis, poisoning them with heavy metals for an infection that, while painful, was rarely fatal on its own. This confusion reached its gruesome peak in 1767 with the Scottish surgeon John Hunter. In a misguided attempt to prove that gonorrhea and syphilis were the same, Hunter famously inoculated a subject, some say he experimented on himself, others say a patient, with pus taken from a man with gonorrhea. Tragically, the donor had a co-infection of both diseases. When the subject developed the hard cankers of syphilis, Hunter triumphantly declared them one and the same. This single experiment set medical science back for decades, condemning thousands of gonorrhea patients to unnecessary toxic treatments. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that the French venereologist Philippe Ricord finally proved they were distinct entities, separating the great pox from the flow of seed. But by then, the bacteria had already cemented its place in history, not just as a disease, but as a source of shame, confusion, and excruciating pain. And as the centuries turned, the street name for the disease would shift from the clinical gonorrhea to something far more visceral, a name that hinted at the violence required to cure it. Chapter 2. Why do they call it the clap? The clap. It is a slang term that has survived for centuries, whispered in barracks, giggled about in schoolyards, and scribbled on bathroom stalls. It sounds percussive, sudden, almost comical, like a sharp burst of applause. But in the annals of medical history, there is absolutely nothing funny about the origin of this word. To understand why this specific nickname has endured while others faded away, we must investigate two competing theories. One is a linguistic journey into the red light districts of France. The other is a journey into sheer physical horror. The first theory, and the one most often cited by polite academics, takes us to medieval France. In the impoverished, overcrowded quarters of Paris, brothels were often referred to as les clapiers. Originally, this word meant rabbit hutches, small, cramped wooden cages where rabbits were bred. It was a dark, cynical metaphor for the sex trade, small, dirty rooms where women were kept in confinement for the pleasure of men. Over time, the association became absolute. If a man spent his evening in Les Clapiers, he would inevitably return with the sickness of the rabbit hutch. The French phrase se clapier eventually migrated across the English Channel, corrupted by English tongues into a shorter, punchier noun, the clap. If this were the only explanation, it would merely be a tragic footnote about the living conditions of medieval sex workers. But there is a second theory, one that is far more visceral, persistent, and terrifying. This theory suggests that the clap is not a reference to where you got the disease, but how doctors tried to fix it. To understand this, we must look at the pathology of untreated gonorrhea. In the days before antibiotics, the infection didn't just cause a burning sensation, it caused a catastrophic blockage. The bacteria triggers a massive immune response, producing copious amounts of thick, sticky pus. Simultaneously, the inflammation causes the urethra, the narrow tube through which urine flows, to swell violently. In severe cases, this leads to a stricture, where the tube swells completely shut. Imagine the panic of a man in the 17th century. His bladder is full, screaming for release, but the exit is sealed tight by swollen flesh and hardened, dried pus. The pain is excruciating, a slow internal bursting. He goes to the barber surgeon, the only medical authority available, begging for relief. The surgeon looks at the swollen organ and offers a mechanical solution. The blockage had to be cleared, and without precision surgical tools, the method was brute force. Historical accounts in military folklore describe a treatment where the infected penis was placed on a hard surface, like a table. The doctor would then take a heavy object, sometimes a large medical textbook, a Bible, or simply their own cupped hands, and bring it down with violent force onto the organ. Smash! The intention was to clap the blockage out. The sheer force of the impact was designed to physically shatter the hardened pus and force the swollen urethra to pop open, allowing the urine and the infection to flow again. Some variations of this story in naval history suggest that sailors would simply clap the organ between their own hands with all their might to clear the morning blockage. It creates a stomach-churning image, the sound of a heavy book slamming down on inflamed flesh, followed by the scream of the patient and the sudden release of fluid. Whether the term the clap originated linguistically from the French rabbit hutches or physically from this brutal percussive cure, the result was the same. The name stuck because it perfectly encapsulated the violence of the disease. It was a condition that demanded a payment in pain. And yet, as horrific as the concept of clapping the infection away might sound, it was only the beginning. For those who sought more sophisticated medical help than a heavy book, the treatments that followed were intricate, expensive, and arguably even more torturous. The smash of the book was primitive, but what the doctors had waiting in their leather bags was the stuff of nightmares. Chapter 3. Instruments of Torture. The Cures before antibiotics. If the mechanical cure of smashing the organ with a book sounds like the desperate act of a madman, surely the professional doctors of the 18th and 19th centuries offered something more refined? They did. But refined in this context simply meant that the instruments of torture were made of polished silver and steel, rather than paper and leather. To understand the nightmare of pre-antibiotic treatment, you must understand the mindset of the era. Medicine was aggressive. Illness was seen as an enemy occupying the body, and it had to be driven out with violence. For gonorrhea, the battlefield was the urethra, a delicate, sensitive mucous membrane that was already inflamed, raw, and bleeding. And into this fragile canal, doctors introduced a horror show of chemical and mechanical invaders. First, there was the obsession with mercury. Because of the long-standing confusion between syphilis and gonorrhea, mercury was the gold standard. But unlike the fumigation chambers used for syphilis, gonorrhea was treated locally. This gave rise to the urethral syringe. These were not the slender plastic needles of today. These were large, menacing devices made of pewter, glass, or silver, with long, thick nozzles. The doctor would fill the syringe with a solution of mercury chloride, a caustic, toxic heavy metal, and insert the cold metal tip deep into the inflamed opening of the patient. The plunger was depressed, forcing the poisonous liquid into the infected canal. The sensation was described as liquid fire. The mercury was supposed to burn away the infection, cauterizing the rotting flesh inside. In reality, it destroyed healthy tissue, caused chemical burns, and slowly poisoned the patient's kidneys and brain. Patients would often leave the doctor's office with the infection still raging, but now accompanied by the metallic taste of mercury in their mouth and teeth that felt loose in their gums. But the chemical burns were nothing compared to the mechanical solutions for strictures. As we mentioned, chronic gonorrhea causes scar tissue to build up, narrowing the urinary passage until it closes completely. Doctors needed a way to force this passage open. Enter the bougie and the dilator. A bougie was a rod, originally made of waxed cloth and later of metal. The doctor would take a thin rod and jam it into the urethra, trying to break through the blockage. If that fit, he would pull it out and shove in a slightly thicker one, then a thicker one. It was a slow, agonizing stretching of raw flesh, often performed without any anesthesia. The patient would have to grip the table, biting down on leather, as the doctor forced these rods past the strictures, often tearing the lining and causing profuse bleeding. For the most stubborn blockages, doctors invented devices that look like they belong in a dungeon, not a clinic. One such instrument was the mechanical dilator, or the urethrotome. Imagine a long, thin metal rod inserted into the narrow passage. Once it was deep inside, past the blockage, the doctor would turn a screw at the handle. The tip of the instrument would then expand, like opening a tiny bladed umbrella inside the body. Some of these devices had hidden blades. Once expanded, the doctor would pull the instrument out. As it withdrew, the blades would slice through the scar tissue and the healthy tissue from the inside out, physically cutting the stricture open. The blood loss was significant. The pain was blinding. And the tragedy was that the resulting wound would often heal into more scar tissue, requiring the procedure to be repeated again and again, trapping the patient in a cycle of eternal surgery. Finally, for those who wanted to avoid the knife, there was the internal cure: cubebs and balsam of copaiba. These were herbal remedies, but do not mistake herbal for gentle. Cubebs were a type of pepper, and balsam was a thick, oily resin derived from South American trees. When ingested, these substances were not digested normally. Their volatile oils were excreted through the urine. The theory was that the medicated urine would wash over the infection and cure it. In practice, it meant that every time the patient urinated, they were passing a fluid that was chemically irritating, effectively peeing liquid pepper. It caused severe nausea, vomiting, and a distinct, pungent odor that seeped from the patient's pores and breath. A man taking balsam of copaiba couldn't hide his condition. He smelled like the disease. He was a social pariah, suffering from a stomach that rejected food and a bladder that burned with every drop, all while the bacteria continued to thrive, largely unaffected by the chemical assault. By the late 19th century, men faced a grim choice: the agonizing untreated stricture that could burst their bladder, or the doctor with his mercury syringes and expanding metal knives. It is no wonder that when war broke out, soldiers would go to extreme lengths to hide their infection, fearing the cure far more than the enemy. Chapter 4: The Soldier's Scourge. Civil War to World War II. When we think of the great wars of history, we visualize bayonet charges, artillery barrages, and the thunder of cavalry. But for the generals commanding these armies, There was an enemy far more terrifying than the opposing force. It was an enemy that didn't shoot back, yet it had the power to dissolve entire regiments from within. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, gonorrhea was the silent saboteur of military efficiency. It was the soldier's scourge, a biological attrition that no treaty could end. The American Civil War offers a staggering glimpse into this hidden battlefield. Union Army records indicate that over 100,000 cases of gonorrhea were treated, and those are just the ones that were reported. In an era where soldiers lived in filth, marched for days, and sought comfort wherever they could find it, the disease ran rampant. But back then, a soldier with the clap was often simply docked pay or mocked. By the time the world descended into the industrial slaughter of World War I, the military approach to gonorrhea shifted from passive neglect to aggressive, humiliating control. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe, famously declared that a soldier with venereal disease was a traitor to the cause. He wasn't just sick, he was damaging government property. To combat this, the military instituted one of the most degrading rituals in service history: the short arm inspection. The scene became a weekly ritual for millions of young men. Entire companies were lined up in the cold, often at the crack of dawn. A medical officer would walk down the line barking the command to drop them. The soldiers would lower their trousers. The officer would then inspect each man's genitals, looking for the telltale discharge of gonorrhea. Often, the men were ordered to milk it down, to physically squeeze their own organ from the base to the tip to force out any hidden pus. It was a moment of profound humiliation, reducing proud soldiers to cattle being checked for ticks. If a drop of white fluid appeared, that soldier was pulled from the line, marked, and often court-martialed or confined to the stockade. But detection was only half the strategy. Prevention was the other, and it was equally brutal. The military introduced prophylaxis stations, or pro-stations. The logic was simple. If a soldier had sex, he had to report to a pro-station immediately afterward to be sanitized. This wasn't a gentle wash. It involved injecting strict antiseptic chemicals like protargol or argyrol directly into the urethra and holding it there for several minutes to burn any potential bacteria. Soldiers faced a grim calculus: risk the court-martial for hiding the disease, or submit to the voluntary torture of the pro-station after every romantic encounter. Many chose to hide it, using black market cures and suffering in silence, until the infection became too severe to conceal. This war on gonorrhea also birthed a new form of psychological warfare, not against the Germans or the Japanese, but against women. Military propaganda posters from World War I and World War II painted civilian women as biological booby traps. The imagery was stark and terrifying. A beautiful, smiling girl next door was depicted with a shadow of a skull over her face. Slogans screamed, "She may look clean, but," or "a jerry trap." The message was clear. Women were the dirty vessels of disease. Men were the innocent victims who needed to be protected. The V-girl, Victory Girl, became a figure of suspicion. In many places, women suspected of being carriers were rounded up and indefinitely detained in specialized hospitals, forced to undergo painful internal exams and toxic treatments without trial. The war on gonorrhea had turned the female body into a tactical threat, dehumanizing women in the name of national security. By the end of the Second World War, the military had streamlined the management of the disease, but they hadn't conquered it. They had simply driven it underground, buried beneath layers of shame, propaganda, and painful chemical irrigation. But while the soldiers suffered in the barracks, a far more tragic victim was suffering in the nursery. Victims who had never marched, never fought, and never sinned, yet paid the highest price for the flow of seed. Chapter 5. The Innocent Victims, Blindness, and the Silver Drop. War is hell. But at least a soldier on the battlefield has a weapon in his hand and a chance to fight back. In the long, sordid history of gonorrhea, the most tragic casualties were not the men who visited brothels, nor the soldiers who lined up at prophylaxis stations. They were the ones who had never taken a step, never spoken a word, and never sinned. They were the newborns, entering the world only to be greeted by permanent darkness. For centuries, gonorrhea was the leading cause of childhood blindness in Europe and America. The medical term is ophthalmia neonatorum. The mechanism of this tragedy is horrifyingly simple. As a baby passes through the birth canal of an infected mother, the bacteria Neisseria gonorrhea, which thrives in warm, moist mucous membranes, transfers from the mother's infected tissue directly into the eyes of the infant. In the days before antibiotics, the progression of the disease was rapid and relentless. Within 2 or 3 days of birth, the infant's eyelids would swell aggressively, becoming red, tense, and hard. Thick yellow-green pus would begin to ooze from the corners of the eyes. But the horror was happening underneath the lids. The bacteria produces an enzyme that literally dissolves the cornea, the clear window of the eye. The pressure inside the eye would build until the cornea ulcerated and perforated. The eye would effectively rupture, collapsing in on itself and healing over as a useless, opaque scar. By the time the parents realized the swelling wasn't just a minor irritation, the child was often irreversibly blind. In 1880, it was estimated that over 30 of all children in European schools for the blind were there solely because their fathers had contracted the clap years earlier. The medical community was desperate for a solution. In 1881, a German obstetrician named Carl Sigmund Franz Krede proposed a method that was as brutal as it was effective. He discovered that silver nitrate, a caustic chemical compound, could kill the bacteria on contact. Krede introduced a mandatory procedure that became standard practice across the Western world for the next century: the Krede maneuver. Immediately after birth, the doctor would pry open the infant's eyelids and drop a 2 solution of silver nitrate directly onto the eyeballs. The result was a medical miracle, but a sensory nightmare. The silver nitrate was an acid. It caused chemical conjunctivitis, a searing, burning chemical burn on the surface of the eye. For the first few days of their lives, these babies would scream in agony, their eyes red and inflamed from the cure. But it worked. The rate of blindness in Krede's hospital dropped from 10 to nearly 0. The scream of the burning child became the price of sight. But behind the screaming infants lay a quieter, darker social tragedy, particularly in the Victorian era. Gonorrhea in women is often asymptomatic, silent. A woman could carry the bacteria for years without the burning pain that men experienced. This biological quirk allowed for a devastating domestic cycle. A wealthy Victorian gentleman would go on his grand tour of Europe, visit a brothel in Paris or Naples, and contract the clap. He would undergo the torturous mercury treatments or mechanical dilations we discussed earlier, and once the discharge stopped, he would assume he was cured. He would return home, marry a respectable, chaste woman, and unknowingly infect her on their wedding night. She would feel nothing, perhaps only a mild irritation. Then, 9 months later, the baby would be born. When the child's eyes began to rot a few days later, the family doctor, who knew the father's history, was placed in an ethical bind. To explain why the baby was blind would be to destroy the reputation of the father and the social standing of the family. So, the diagnosis was often hidden. The mother was told the baby had a weak constitution or had caught a cold in the eyes. The woman was left to raise a blind child, often becoming infertile herself due to the untreated infection spreading to her uterus, never knowing that the darkness in her nursery was brought home by her husband. It was the ultimate betrayal. The sins of the father visited upon the child, sealed with a drop of burning silver. Chapter 6. The Superbug Returns. The Penicillin False Dawn. For thousands of years, humanity lived in the shadow of the clap. We fought it with prayers, with mercury, with torture, and with shame. And we lost. But then, in the middle of the 20th century, the sun seemed to rise on a new world. The discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming and its mass production during World War II felt less like a scientific breakthrough and more like a divine intervention. Suddenly, the monster that had disfigured faces and blinded babies for millennia was defanged. The cures we have spent the last hour describing, the terrifying urethral injections, the metal dilators, the burning silver drops, were swept into the dustbin of history almost overnight. Gonorrhea, once a life-altering sentence of pain, became a trivial nuisance. A single shot of penicillin in the buttocks, a few hours of waiting, and the bacteria was obliterated. This medical miracle triggered a cultural earthquake. By the 1960s and 70s, the fear that had policed human sexuality for centuries evaporated. The sexual revolution wasn't just powered by the birth control pill, it was powered by antibiotics. Without the threat of incurable agony, the clap became a joke, a rite of passage for rock stars and soldiers in Vietnam. It was no longer a curse, it was just a social cold, easily fixed with a quick visit to the clinic. But in our hubris, we forgot a fundamental law of nature. Life finds a way. And Neisseria gonorrhea is one of the most resilient, adaptive life forms on this planet. While we were celebrating the end of infectious disease, the bacteria was quietly training. It was in the brothels of Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War that the first cracks in the armor appeared. Soldiers began returning with infections that didn't respond to the standard dose of penicillin. The bacteria had learned. It had acquired a genetic weapon called penicillinase, an enzyme that could chew up the antibiotic molecule and spit it out before it could do any harm. So medicine escalated the war. We threw tetracycline at it. The bacteria evolved resistance within a decade. We switched to fluoroquinolones, like ciprofloxacin, in the 1980s. By the mid-2000s, those were rendered useless. It was a biological chess match, and the bacteria was always one move ahead. Neisseria gonorrhea is what microbiologists call naturally competent. It acts like a biological kleptomaniac. It can reach out and grab DNA from other bacteria in its environment, instantly downloading the instructions for survival. It doesn't just evolve, it steals the blueprints for resistance. In 2011, the nightmare scenario finally arrived. Scientists identified a strain in Japan, named H041, that was effectively resistant to all recommended antibiotics. This was the birth of super gonorrhea. Today, we are down to our very last line of defense, a dual therapy of ceftriaxone and azithromycin. But reports are already surfacing from the UK, Australia, and Asia of strains that are shrugging off even this final cocktail. The implications are terrifying. We are standing on the precipice of a post-antibiotic era. Imagine a world where a simple sexual encounter could lead to an infection that no pill can cure. We are not just looking at the return of painful urination. We are looking at the return of the complications we thought were ancient history. Pelvic inflammatory disease rendering millions of women infertile. Ectopic pregnancies. Joint infections that destroy mobility. And yes, the return of ophthalmia neonatorum, blinding a new generation of children. The false dawn of the penicillin era lasted less than 80 years, a mere blink in human history. The bacteria used that time to upgrade its armor, while we grew complacent. Now, the monsters of the past are stirring again. The metal dilators and the mercury syringes are gone, but if the antibiotics fail completely, we may find ourselves wishing we still had them. The science that saved us has hit a wall, and on the other side of that wall, the flow of seed is waiting to become a flood once more. And so, the curtain falls on thousands of years of agony. We have traveled a long, scarred road tonight. From the sun-baked sands of ancient Egypt, where men prayed for relief from the strangery, to the cold clinical tables of the Victorian barber surgeons with their metal hooks and mercury syringes. We have seen how a microscopic organism has shaped human history, decimated armies, and blinded the innocent, demanding a terrible toll for the simple act of human connection. Ultimately, the story of Neisseria gonorrhea is not just a medical case study. It is a dark mirror held up to civilization itself. It reflected our ignorance when we mistook infection for a flow of seed. It reflected our capacity for brutality when we chose to smash, burn, and slice the human body rather than understand it. And perhaps most damning of all, it reflected our arrogance in the 20th century, when we believed that a single discovery in a petri dish had conquered nature forever. We now stand at a crossroads. The era of the magic bullet, the age of cheap, easy antibiotics, is drawing to a close. The bacteria has proven to be a patient, intelligent adversary, evolving in the dark, stripping the weapons from our hands one by one. The clapping of the medieval surgeon's book may be a relic of the past, but the fear it represented is returning. We are slowly drifting back toward a world where a moment of pleasure can carry a lifetime of consequences. A world where the social cold becomes an incurable curse once more. The question remains, in the eternal arms race between human ingenuity and bacterial evolution, who will strike the final blow? Thank you for walking this painful path with me tonight. I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe science will find a new miracle? Or are we doomed to face the superbug with empty hands? Leave your verdict in the comments below. And if you found value in this deep dive into the shadows of medical history, please subscribe to the 9 p.m. Historian and turn on the bell. There are many more secrets buried in the archives, waiting to be exhumed. I am your guide to the past. Sleep well.